was really excited to do the Discovering Your Communication Style assignment after hearing Mahathi's Day in the Life of a Direct Communicator speech a few weeks back. I also personally just love quizzes. I used to waste so much time on BuzzFeed trying to figure out which breakfast food most symbolized myself and which season was the best representation of my future path. So once I finally got to level 2 on pathways, I jumped right on and logged onto this quiz. And the results were straight 3s down the line, which might be good, might be bad, overall, very inconclusive. This must be what it feels like to be divergent. With that said, I started thinking about different types of communication styles beyond the 4 that Toastmasters talks about. Particularly now having moved back to Boston, I started thinking about regional communication styles, which brings us to 3 lessons that I've learned from the East Coast. When I first thought about moving to the East Coast for college a few years ago, I at first was very intimidated. Growing up in Minnesota, I had often heard that East Coast was very brute. It was very harsh. It was very quick and rude. And overall, I had a lot of concerns about moving to Philadelphia and experiencing that type of communication. But now, having spent nearly a quarter of my life on the East Coast, I realized that there are a lot of really great things to learn from the East Coast communication style. The first one is small talk. Growing up, I never really understood the purpose of small talk. To me, it just felt like wasting time. You're talking about the same things over and over. Weather can only be so important and so interesting. And it just felt like an intermission before actually getting to the good stuff of the conversation, getting the questions or the answers that I wanted to hear. But now, having been on the East Coast, I've realized that it's so important to develop rapport and to develop support with the person that you're talking to. There are so many cool nuances that I wouldn't have realized about people. I wouldn't have known that my coworker actually spent a significant amount of time growing up in Minneapolis when he was younger, or that Carpagum's son actually went to the same school as I did, but for his MBA. Small things that I never would have realized if I hadn't engaged in small talk. Next up, complain. Nicely. I think complaining is an art. Growing up in Minnesota, if my family and I didn't have a good experience at a restaurant, honestly, it was probably more our fault than the restaurant's fault. But having come out to the East Coast, I realized that complaining is an art if it's used respectfully and effectively. This makes me think about an experience that I had at a restaurant in Philadelphia. My friends and I had made a reservation. We got there on time, but the restaurant ended up being so backed up that we had to wait over 45 minutes, which honestly was perfectly fine. We just sat at the bar, we had a few drinks, and of course we were quite hungry by the time we were actually seated, but we made some fun out of it. At the end of the meal, as my sock Dollinger, I talked to the server and I said, "Thank you so much for the meal. It was delicious and lovely, but it was a little disappointing to have waited for so long after we came in with reservations." And to my surprise, they actually ended up getting us a free dessert. But the more important thing about complaining is that it gave me an opportunity to air my feelings and my thoughts. And I think if I hadn't mentioned that, I probably would have gone home that evening ruminating about the experience, maybe being a little grumbly and mumbly about the fact that we had to wait for so long before being seated. So the art of complaining is less about getting that free dessert and more about getting your thoughts and your opinions out into the air for the world to hear. And finally, advocate. I think advocating is so important, particularly now as I'm embarking into my professional career. For me, I really love doing a lot of things outside of just the typical 9 to 5 or 5 to 9 of work, whether that's finding a new platform or starting a new initiative, or for me personally, organizing virtual volunteer events. It's so easy for everyone in the office to just see, oh, Annie sent out another email about a virtual volunteer event. But what they don't see is the many hours that I've put in organizing that, whether that's communicating with the charity or figuring out the logistics or scheduling time on the calendar. If I didn't advocate for myself, all that work would go unrecognized. But more importantly, advocating for yourself is so important to be able to get to the goals that you want to achieve. Coming to LEK, I knew I really wanted to be on a pro bono project because I love working with nonprofits. The thing is, LEK only does 2 to 3 every year, and they usually only go to experienced associates. My first day in Boston, once I stepped foot into that office, I made a beeline to the partner's office to start talking about how much I wanted to be on these pro bono cases. I must have annoyed them enough to the point where they actually did put me on one earlier this year. Back in February, I got to do a project for the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which was one of the highlights of my career so far. And I know for a fact that I wouldn't have gotten that opportunity had I not started advocating for myself on day one. Overall, I've taken away 3 very important lessons from my time on the East Coast: small talk, complaining nicely, and advocating for myself. I've been so fortunate to be able to experience different communication styles, whether that's Minnesota or East Coast, and I'm so excited to be able to bring these little lessons along with me, whether it's Boston, Rochester, China, or beyond. Thank you so much, and Madam Toastmaster, back to you.